Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Living the Line. I'm Carson Grubaugh. I'm running a solo show today. Brandon and Sean have been picking up the slack as I take the summer off of anything other than one-man reviews because I'm working on my book Bound. But I had to get in this interview with Mr. Hunter Delaney. Welcome to the show, Hunter.
Thank you for having me. It's like a very surreal experience to have been a viewer of the channel for a while now, and like to be on here is weird. It's like very surreal to me.
Well, I take that as a compliment, but we're just a bunch of guys that like comic books. So to me, it's just talking to buddies. But what happened is Hunter reached out and said, "Hey, can I send you a copy of my book?" And of course, I said yes. I like free books. And Hunter sent over this comic, The History of Hardcore. And I don't think Hunter, you understood when you sent it over, like how much the content of the book would be right up my alley as it was, but it's also very well written, very engaging. So if you haven't seen that yet, yesterday, not yesterday when we recorded this, but yesterday from the posting of this, I will have posted a review of the book. So if you haven't checked that out, go back and check that out, get a sense of the book. But yeah, what spurred this history of hardcore project on? I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Um, well, so I grew up in like the hardcore scene in Orange County,
Okay.
California. I grew up here in Orange County and lived here most of my life at this point. But I started out doing like tour documentary, videography, that kind of thing
Okay.
for a lot of these bands because back in the day, I had noticed, well, I originally I was like, I got to be a guitar player, right? I'm going to be a guitar player.
Yeah.
I'm going to go on tour. This, how could it go wrong? And eventually I realized, oh, I know how. It's because I'm not going to be a guitar player. Like I love playing guitar. I'm all right at it. I will never be a touring musician.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to find a way to like accomplish what I wanted within that scene. And concurrently, I was also getting more interested in making videos and just goofing off with my friend. And it kind of started to consume me. And I took those interests and applied it to hardcore and like the punk rock scene. And I decided to start filming just my friend's band. And that became something that turned into me eventually going on something called Warp Tour,
Hmm.
which younger people won't know, unfortunately, but you know, our generation
Yeah.
definitely knows what it is. I went to Europe with a band doing tour documentary stuff, and I've done some a lot of different work throughout the years for bands of varying sizes within the scene, sometimes like adjacent to the scene. And in college, this is all happening, and I kind of was getting a little bit disinterested in some capacity with film, which is what I went to school for.
Hmm.
And it it was the sort of thing where I wanted to find something that I could just have for fun, and but also it came about through hardcore where I rediscovered comics. And
Okay.
um I was really interested in comics as a kid, and I, you know, did what every kid does. I bought comics, was like copying panels out of the book, and um, I was like, wow, I'm so good at this. And I just started doing it all the time, and I became better at drawing because of it. And luckily, my dad's an artist too, so
Okay.
he has more of like an NC Wyeth kind of real painterly style and like real illustrative, but that was never really what I wanted to do. So I didn't think that there was a place for any kind of drawing like that. And then to sort of bring it back around to the hardcore thing, um, I had gone to this show it was in the back, it was like a warehouse in the back of a comic book shop, sort of like a loading dock. And I went into the store to just kind of like pass the time in between bands, and there was a bunch of cool stuff on the shelf, and it was just from that point on, I kind of I, took a little nibble of books there and I picked up a few, and then it became like coming back a few weeks later and then coming back every week. And then eventually it just became something that I was like super passionate about. And I realized that there's nothing really conveying what hardcore music is in a comic book format, at least in
Hmm.
my estimation, at least for somebody that isn't as familiar with comic books, right? Like you and I know
Yeah.
what Love and Rockets is, but
Yeah.
who on the street is going to know what that is? And so that's where I was like, well, I think it'd be cool to kind of have a comic book to explain to people what it is that I'm into. Cause like I can't tell you how many times I was, at family gatherings or whatever, being like, oh yeah, I'm really into hardcore music. And my uncles would be like, what's that? The Ramones, like that kind of thing. Or their perception was like hair metal. Like my dad,
Oh.
friends with the family lore is that uh him and his brothers taught the guitar player of Warrant, Eric Turner, how to play guitar.
That's
And
pretty
it's like,
cool. Family
yeah, it's like,
lore.
yeah, it's semi-true because like I've met Eric and he's a nice guy and he's like, yeah, I owe everything to your dad and your
Wow.
uncles. They showed me what to do. But their perception was like, yeah, that's hard, that's heavy. And like
Yeah.
the whole time I was like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Like Number of the Beast is cool, but it's not hard,
No,
And
yeah.
so that's sort of what my inspiration was for the book, was to give something to show my world to people that wouldn't know and wouldn't get an inauthentic look at that. Because to me, there's a ton of stuff out there that's like that. And I think that when somebody who is trying to, it'd be like if I was trying to tell a story about mathematics, right? Like I don't get math. Like that's
Yeah.
not my thing. And and somebody who is into comics and reads this book about math, they're gonna see this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't done even the bare minimum amount of research, and it doesn't feel like he knows what it is even beneath the sort of research of it and the feeling and the ideas behind it. So I wanted to at least try it and see if it worked. And, you know, I think I was happy with it in the end. And I feel like there's a lot of positive feedback that I've gotten on it, which is awesome. And yeah, so that's a
It
long-winded
is.
explanation, but
It is a very good, like when I started reading it, there was a little bit where I was a little bit skeptical about you being a character in it at first, but then throughout the story, like the shenanigans with the Keeper of the Truth and all of that, like you managed to not only do like I think kind of like for hardcore what Ed Piskor did for hip hop with like the hip hop family tree. I mean, you don't go for as many years worth as he does, but it's kind of like volume one of Hip Hop Family Tree, but for hardcore in terms of the historical information, which is great because you're kind of explaining the history right up to where I started listening to it, the time when I would have started getting into music in high school. Um, but then also through these other story elements that at first I was like, man, I don't know, just tell me the history. I actually wound up being like, oh, no, 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 no. I see what he's doing. He's showing someone what it's like. He's showing someone the mindset. He's showing someone the little squabbles about, no, they're not a real hardcore band. And unlike you talking about your uncle, that's not heavy. There is like this, and any girl I've ever talked to about any largely male dominated thing, comics, music, games, or whatever, they all face that same thing where they're like, oh, I love Batman. And it's like, you don't know Batman. Do you know who fucking, Dick Giordano or what, like those kind of guys. And you really captured that aspect. You captured the kind of, um, you actually explained to me my own upbringing in a way in the book where I was like, oh, that's why I'm such like a staunch do it myself individualist. Is like I grew up in this milieu where this was like the ethic. I didn't really know it. I was never that into it in the way you explain it. So I think you did that very well in the book, because to someone who it's not like in the scene but loves that heavy music and was around bands like that, it felt in the same way you say Love and Rockets would have felt right to certain people at a certain time. Your book is like, yeah, guys at least my age are like, fuck yeah, that's hardcore. But you must be really, really active in the scene to get it captured so specifically and potently.
I feel like I used to be. I'm like what I would call like a lapsed hardcore kid.
Okay.
Um, because, I got a son and I have my wife, and those like that's always going to be my priority.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people in the hardcore scene, it's like hardcore, wife, kid, and it's not like wife, kid, anything else is kind of like doesn't matter,
Yeah.
which is like my mindset. And so how I do it now, or how I experience it now, is I'll go to a show every once in a while, and maybe I'll bring my camera, or like if a friend's band asks me to film something, I will. But most of the time, I'm just listening to the music. And I think it is, to tie it back to what you were saying about the sort of upbringing of it, I've spent so much time going to these shows that like when I approach anything like related to hardcore, and I sit down and I draw it, or like if it's something I'm writing, to me, I like, don't have to try because it's just how I think. It's
Yeah.
not like I'm um like, oh well, let me get back in the headspace. It's like, no, it's like in the line in the Hulk movie where
Hmm.
he's like, what are you doing? How do you keep it under wraps? And he's like, the key is I'm always angry. It's like that's sort of how it is. I'm like a closeted, lapsed hardcore kid where I can go out in public and not wear a crazy death metal shirt or something like that. And when I tell people like, oh yeah, I'm into like a little bit more aggressive music, they're like, oh, like what? Like Slipknot? I'm like, no, it's crazier than that. And so yeah. I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like I lost a little bit of the thread there.
I think I don't know if I even was asking you a question so much as like confirming, yeah, you did the thing good. The other thing I wanted to tell you is also that, well, I mean, in text message, you know this, you did such an accurate job of portraying all of this that I assumed you were from New England area, because I always associate the real like we always called it group chant hardcore, like where there's like five guys all shouting the same thing at once. Me and my friends always associated that hard like with New England, and that's like real hardcore. And we were always a little bit metalcore, less of the straight hardcore stuff. Like a lot of the bands mentioned in the book, I've heard of them all, and I go listen to them. I'm like, yeah, we would have heard that stuff and been like, it sounded a little old to us at that time. So you were so convincing that I thought you were from that time. So that might be another good entry point then, is establishing for both me and you, like what years are we talking about when you're talking about being involved in the scene, being involved in Warped Tour? Like what years, what were some of the bands in Southern California that you were around filming, going on tour with, that kind of stuff? For me,
Yeah.
it was like the mid 90s.
Yeah, that's like a great era. I feel like there's a lot of explosion in like the, aggressive music and like the hardcore world at that time. And but to answer your question, I grew up in like the Orange County scene of like the mid 2000s. So like
Okay.
trying to think of like the first show that I went to, what year that would have been.
So you're
Because
like in your early 30s then? You're
I'm
about 2 years.
30. I'm
Yeah.
30
Oh,
right now.
okay. So you're like 12 years younger than me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think like the band Alexis on Fire.
Yeah.
So they were the first like hardcore-ish band that I saw, and that was like probably 2008. And that was one of those shows that like just changed my mind about everything I wanted to do. Like um they had the tour package was Alexis on Fire headlining, and then I forget, there was like a band that I often confuse for being on the tour, but now after doing some research, I know that they weren't. I don't know where I got this information that I thought they were on the tour, but the other bands were um, this band called Law Dispute. They're more of like Joyce Manor kind of, not quite hardcore, but not uh wouldn't be defined as like alternative. And then they had opening for the show this band called Trash Talk, and Trash Talk was the scariest experience as a 14-year-old. The singer, his name's Lee Spielman. Now I know that this guy is infamous for just doing crazy shit all the time. And he start at one point started swinging the mic and lowering it and like inches above our heads, and you're sardined in the venue there, so you don't have anywhere to go. There's no escaping it. He swings it back and then he starts beating his head like he's like Gigi Allen or something like that, beating himself up. And I was like, this is so cool. And you got dudes stage diving over you
Yeah.
left and right. And then it kind of opened my mind, and I eventually got back to like more traditional hardcore. At the time, the people I was hanging out with were more into like um, the like Warped Tour metalcore brand of music. So like I would say like the best band out of that, like the band that stayed the most, is like Under Oath.
Yeah.
And then concurrently, I was also like deeply into Avenged Sevenfold. They're still my favorite band. And they're not really like a hardcore metalcore band anymore at all. But
No, they're more like prog prog metal kind of 80s-ish.
they're I would call them a like heavy rock band now.
Yeah.
But when they started out, they were like, and all the bands that they used to like roll with. So you get like 18 Visions and Bleeding Through and that kind of stuff, the more like almost like symphonic death metal if it was brought into the hardcore world.
Yeah,
Um,
I associate them more as like metal Avenged
yeah,
Sevenfold, more melodic and stuff.
yeah,
And more like
exactly. Yeah, their guitar music. Like there's not like a whole, like they're all great musicians, but they're definitely more like guitar centric, whereas the other stuff that I eventually came around to with bands like Terror and Cruel Hand and gosh, there's so many of them. But I was in that metalcore space during high school, which was like
Yeah.
2007 to 2011. And then when I got out of high school and went into college, um, I had kind of like not been as interested in that stuff. And I had gone to see Stick to Your Guns, and eventually they would become my friends, and like I worked for them a little bit. And you know they are like a gateway band for a lot of kids, and it's because their music is accessible and melodic, and there's not it has the ethos of hardcore, but it's not as steeped in the you know kind of attitude of like I'm too cool for you.
Hmm.
It's more approachable to like a everyday kind of kid. But they would take out a lot of these bands that you would never see otherwise. So there's this group Trapped Under Ice that I saw that was like really wild to see at an early age. And then bands like Terror, even bands from like the UK they would bring out. And so just opened up this whole world of like the more traditional side of hardcore for me. Um, and yeah, I just haven't really looked back because there's an emotionality to it that I don't think, and not to say like metalcore doesn't have it. There's a lot of really good metalcore out there
Hmm.
that I like will always love. I'm never gonna say like I only listen to hardcore. Right? There's a ton of stuff that I listen to.
So many people shit on metalcore, but like there's a lot of good
Dude,
music in there.
they're all posers if they do. Like I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but metalcore is awesome. And if all the like hardcore gatekeepers out there want to cancel me or whatever, go ahead. But I think like metalcore is sick. Um, and yeah, like uh, it just is one of those things where it's ah man, I lost my train of thought a little bit, but
Well,
I
even
just
it's funny because like me being 12 years older than you, I'm already like you started with metalcore. How could you even I have a little bit of that. But then plenty of people would come to me and be like, "You started listening to like Zayo in the 90s." Like that's metalcore. That's not or like the first band I ever called hardcore was Korn because like at the time now we call that new metal, but at the time there wasn't another word for heavy, but it wasn't like metal stuff. It was slower and groovier. So yeah, like Korn was hardcore, Deftones was hardcore for me at the time. But anyone who's into like the stuff in your book would have been like, "Fuck is that shit?"
no way, yeah,
Yeah.
no way, yeah.
So it's funny to hear you for me to hear you say, especially because you make a joke about crabcore at some point in the book. And what you're describing to me is like scene kid, crabcore, metalcore kind of music. And so it's really funny to hear that's where you started.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think enough people are willing to admit that in the hardcore world. Like, I think
Yeah.
like it's you know what, like it is what it is. I started out with the swoop hair too, you know. I was
The
up, yeah, the like MySpace like emotions are
yeah.
welling inside me kind of attitude with the hair, you know. But it's all about like what gets you there, you know, and
Yeah.
like I guess this is I remember my train of thought in that like the traditional hardcore there's like this emotionality of anger that I
Hmm.
don't think gets tapped into in a lot of the excuse me metalcore um stuff because it's a little bit more it's almost kind of like dramatic, a little bit more like
Yeah.
theatrical in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, at least in terms of like the musical side of it, not necessarily the performance, right? There's a lot
Well,
of
because it
crossover.
is more melodic, it tends to like one of the things, like I mentioned Zayo as one of my like that was the band for me in high school. I mean, there Korn was the first time I heard heavy music, and I was like, this is amazing. And then it was all I mean, heavy music, anything from out there. I remember hearing like Cannibal Corpse really early too, and thinking like this vocals are so like I thought it was funny. Actually, no, it was Napalm Death. Napalm
Oh,
Death
okay.
was on like think it was the Mortal Kombat, the very first Mortal Kombat
Oh,
movie. Their
wow.
soundtrack was all Napalm Death, Fear Factory, and I just thought it was so funny. This and then my uncle had a independent like music review little thing he did in Southern California for the longest time back in the day. So he would get all these records and stuff. He knew who Napalm Death was, and he introduced me to like Cannibal Corpse and Voivod, and he was showing me
Yeah.
some stuff like that. Um, but yeah, Zayo was the first like really, really metal band. But what I liked about them was they had that cinematic quality in
Hmm.
their melodies, and you could kind of envision angels fighting demons. And I think that's what you're hitting at is that it is, yeah, cinematic. It kind of takes you on emotional journeys and paints pictures and stuff.
Yeah,
The good,
exactly.
good stuff.
Yeah. And I think that whereas hardcore, it's just like I'm pissed and you got to know why.
Yeah.
And it's just all about let me tell you what the problem is, you know. There's not a lot of anything outside of that, but I think like the people who are interested in that, uh, at least like from my observation, it, they are the people who there's like just something inside you that like there's like some kind of trauma that has just informed you like I've got it, you know, like I'm not
Yeah.
afraid to say it. And uh I just regularly find myself tapping into that. And when I listen to this stuff, you know, you get that cathartic experience where it's like I let it out mentally through my headphones, and I don't have
Yeah.
to worry about going to a show anymore and being aggressive and being almost, brutish um, with what you do. But as a quick side note, I wanted to say this. I remember you're talking about Zayo. I
Mhm.
remember as a kid, Zayo, they had that like this weird album art a lot of the time.
They
And
just always had like whatever they did just fascinated me. The lyrics, the art, like everything about it just seemed
yeah,
different.
it was
Yeah.
super out there. And I remember watching MTV, and I think it was like Headbangers Ball or something like that. And an ad came up for Zayo Obzen, and I remember thinking
Oh, that's
like,
Meshuggah's Obzin?
was it? It was one. It was
Obzin is by Meshuggah, yeah.
yeah. So it was Obzen, and then there was another Zayo ad next to it.
Okay.
And I was like, what is going on? I was so disturbed as a kid because, I grew up in like a pretty strict Christian household. And so
Okay.
to me, I was like, whoa, like this is not cool. I shouldn't be watching this. And yeah, I always, whenever I think of Zaya, it's like what comes to mind is like being a kid looking at these ads on Headbangers Ball, just being like, whoa, I
But
can't.
but they were like in the because I was also raised in a pretty, you know, wouldn't say super uptight, but pretty Christian household. And I think probably from some of the hints of things in your book, like you're pretty aware of how awesome Christian hardcore and metal is too. Like that some of the best angry music came out of especially that 90s Christian hardcore scene. But that was one of the things that allowed Zayo into my life. My uncle actually gave me the CD, but they were on the Christian label, um, Solid State, and they were a Christian band at first. I wouldn't call them that now, but that's funny that you reacted to them like I'm gonna get in trouble with this because actually that's the one I could take home and be like, but mom, Living Sacrifice, Zayo, they're Christian bands, Jesus Christ, yes,
Yeah.
like,
I had no idea at the time. Like I didn't like of course I know now. And I
yeah.
remember thinking as a kid, like, dear God, like this is crazy. And I just when I heard that they were a Christian band, I like kind of was like rethinking everything in my head.
Yeah, so that's funny to hear that you grew up. Do you have any relationship between that upbringing and the hardcore, or are they kind of are different
Um,
things for you?
well, so like I think so like I'm still a Christian and so it's interesting having that perspective looking at like um hardcore now because I see a lot of um religiosity in it.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think growing up in like a little bit more of like a restrictive Christian house, um, and like my parents were cool with punk rock. Like they grew up going to see like Adolescents. My dad is friends with Agent Orange because it like, and my mom too. And like, they grew up in like basically this tri-city area where like all of those early Orange County punk bands were playing all the time. And so
Hmm.
they would go see them, they were friends with them, and they kind of assumed like that's what this hardcore stuff was. They weren't aware of like what the punk that they knew eventually became.
Yeah.
And I think at the time, like I went to Catholic high school too. And so when I like first heard this aggressive stuff, I was like, on some level, I was like, this is perfect. This is so unlike everything I have to deal with all the time. And then you find like, straight edge and uh, all these other like sort of like rule lifestyle sets that exist within the hardcore world. And I think that's what was like so and it's so different than what I perceived like Christianity as at the time. Um, and so it really connected me with the music that much more. And like I was straight edge for a long time. And um, I think looking at it now, it's just interesting because it is sort of the same kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's this like ideal that although there's not like a god figure that you're praying to or something like that. There is this like, you will not do this, you will not do that. This means I'm better than you. It's almost like an evangelical Christian perspective within the hardcore scene.
Hmm.
And I just think that's like so interesting to me. But to sort of more directly answer your question, it definitely, I think, made me more interested in the stuff that might not be interesting to my parents. Like, and eventually they found it to be like kind of interesting, which surprised me. Like my mom has seen Avenged Sevenfold with me like 2 or 3 times.
Oh
And,
wow.
and she
That's
took
pretty
me to
fun.
see, yeah, she took me to see Iron Maiden one time. And
Okay.
so it's just surprising how it turned out. But I think ultimately it was that sort of way of saying like, no, like this, I don't want to listen to your stuff. Like this is cool. This is scary. I
Yeah.
like, it's almost like this is a little bit risque. I want to listen to that stuff.
Yeah, and it's I feel like there's maybe your parents are right on the edge of like the last generation of parents that actually could be stressed by their child's music, where they're like, no, 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 this has gone too far. I look at a lot of my students now and their stuff sounds too much like music to me. You know, like they can't do anything to like their parents are around my age, and what are they going to bring home that's going to piss off their parents when I'm like I've got like Mike Patton just hawking loogies into a microphone in my playlist, you know? It's like they can't they can't do it. I kind of feel bad for them because that was a huge part of being like a teenager, right? Is like
Yeah,
it's scary. Like I've gone further than somebody else.
yeah, I agree. I think it's like yeah, it's like you're saying, like I don't think, I haven't even thought about that. Like I wonder what music my son is gonna bring home, or like what stuff he's gonna end up being interested in, because I kind of don't want him to be interested in hardcore and like heavy music, because like to me it's like a sign of like something's gone wrong. Like you're like there's a screw loose, you know. I don't want
Yeah.
that for my son. And like I if he if he ends up bringing it home and be like, cool dude, like we can listen to stuff, but I don't think it would be as scary as like me bringing home like a shirt from this band like Reign Supreme that says F, like fuck the world on the back.
Yeah.
And like my dad seeing it, and he took the shirt and like picked up dog crap from the lawn and then told me about it later. He's like, "Oh, did you miss your shirt?" And
Oh
like that
wow.
kind of stuff. So like that level of like shock, I don't think would like worry me now, but like I could
Yeah.
see, like you're saying, like my parents being on the edge of that. Yikes, like what could he bring home next, you know?
Yeah, like my parents, I could still play stuff and they'd be like, that's not even music," or like he's not like what are you? It's just noise, you know, that kind of reaction. Um, Also, you're talking about like this screw loose thing, which is kind of interesting because it sounds like you're associating that with hardcore in specific and the really committed people, not just heavy music in general. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think like in my mind, there's like metal, which is just like sort of general audience level. And
Yeah.
then there's you know, maybe like metalcore. You're getting a little bit deeper. You're treading the waters of what eventually becomes like people with a lot of like hurt and a lot of um like things that they struggle with
Yeah.
throughout their life, and it's like a bonding component to like these people at the very bottom of the outlier, or like the people on the fringes of the fringes,
Yeah.
that ties them all together. And yeah, it's an interesting component to what I feel like happens in hardcore, because I've just seeing how a lot it's different now for sure, because like you have bands like Turnstile, which are like being used in Taco Bell commercials, and
Which is weird.
it's crazy, dude. It's good for them, you know.
Yeah.
They're doing it. But like they are bringing in kids that are just like interested in the sound, which to me, I think will eventually make it so the music grows and changes in a
Yeah.
more positive way because I don't think it's worth anybody's time to keep doing the same stuff that's been happening for, you know, since the
No.
80s, 70s, it's just not there's only so much anger you can put out into the world without trying to do something that like changes that.
Is Turnstile accepted by like the hardcore? It's hard to talk about hardcore because like the hardcore community.
Yeah, 100%. So the
Really?
drummer of this band Trapped Under Ice that I mentioned earlier is the frontman for Turnstile.
Mm.
And the drummer for Turnstile used to be, if I remember correctly, maybe I'm wrong, I believe he was in a band called Code Orange. They used to be called Code Orange Kids, and I
They've been
think he was.
popular for the last few years. Code Orange.
Yeah, yeah. And so they are like when hardcore kids hear about, at least at my age, hear about Turnstile, it's like they're the guys that made it. Like they did it. They did what nobody
Oh,
else could do.
okay.
And they're like still well respected because I think they still have the ethos, they still have the mindset. They bring a lot of people um like on tours that are in the scene.
Okay.
And even like they had like a fill-in guitar player who was from this band Take Offense, and they're like a crossover band. Um, and he's like the guitar player. He's you know what I would say is like for sure hardcore. Like he's a guy from the hardcore scene in San
Yeah.
Diego.
Okay.
Um, and so it's like cool to me, but there are definitely bands where I'm like I think people don't think of them as hardcore bands. So when they appear on a hardcore show, it's kind of like th- some people will scratch their heads. I think it's cool because it adds
Yeah.
variety and it changes things up.
Yeah, that's the reason I asked that is because one of the things that stood out to me about Turnstile is it's hardcore at the core of what it is, but then they have all of these flourishes that come from Latin music and like all kinds of other places. Especially the drummer will do things that are coming from other drum languages and whatnot. Some of the little cowbell things he adds on top or whatever. And it's surprising to me that that's accepted in the community. I feel like metal is much more likely to be like, let's get this strange Chinese instrument. Let's do pirates plus metal. Uh, let's do polka
Vikings
metal.
plus metal.
Yeah, like in metal, there's this offshoot at least where everything's a joke. There's a lot of
Mhm.
humor in like metal that's not in hardcore, and I feel like Turnstile was bringing some of that more like, hey, we can use any style, we can mix anything with this. So it's heartening to hear that that's accepted as
Yeah.
still really hardcore scene stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's cool too because they I feel like they're like let's have fun with it. And
Yeah,
I feel like there are other bands within the scene that are like that. Like Drain is another band that I think is really cool, and they're more of like that crossover sound. But they're a band that's just about fun. And I think even to tie it back to there being like this level of like an emotionality to hardcore, it's a lot of like let's just sit in our emotion and not like, hey, like we can be mad, but yo, let's snap out of it. Let's try to like get ourselves to a better place. And I think like bands like Drain and Turnstile are trying to do that for people in a way that maybe they're conscious of or maybe they're not. But I think it's a cool thing to see because it's only going to be got more and more bands that end up putting that out there.
yeah, and like you said, it's an evolution of the style. It's actually growing. I think that was one of, I was talking about a lot of the bands you reference in the book that I'd heard of, aware of, but when I listened to them, they were in the 80s. So by the time it was coming to me in the 90s, it didn't sound fresh or interesting anymore. It's just kind of like yeah, that's the basics. That's expected. That's like I know where this is gonna go. And the bands I was getting interested in were the ones that were like taking it to the next place. And then I've always kind of been, that's always my interest, comics, music, whatever. I always want to see where it's going more than where it's been. Um and so yeah, I always had a hard time going back to those older bands that had that really like pure aesthetic. And that's where like you're talking about all this like they got to be these damaged kids. Like, well, maybe that's why I never was like in the scene. It was just music I listened to, but I'm gonna listen to heavy music in general all over the map. And then the straight edge thing is interesting because that did coincide so significantly with being involved in like the Christian metal scene. Those two things overlap really well. And the joke was always that like the straight edge kids were like the Christians except they swore. That was basically it. And then I would have people, I had a big, I said this in the review of your book. You just haven't seen the review yet, but I had this big t-shirt with the big white X and a circle on it that came from Alex Ross's comic book Earth X. It was a promo for the Earth X comic book that he did with John Paul Leon. But I just had this shirt that I'd got from a convention and I wore it because it was like a comic book thing. And people would always assume because I was in a band and I liked horn and stuff, they're like, oh, you're so straight edge. And I was Christian, so I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, and at the time I didn't even swear or anything. So yeah, they always assume that. And I was like, no, what, a what? A who? No, oh, okay. But I never
Yeah.
got embedded in it like that. Like we were around it, I liked the music. Um, so it's interesting to see it from your perspective as like an ethos.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting too, because like, shirts and clothing with like the X on it
Hmm.
is just as similar to like people wearing like a church shirt or
Yeah.
like you know having a sticker on the back of your car or
The
even
little
putting
fish.
yeah, exactly, like it's the same kind of idea. So it's interesting that you had that experience where you're wearing this shirt and people come up and ask you, because I would have been one of those people asking you like, oh, are you straight edge?
Yeah.
Because whenever I see that, because of what I know. It's like, a secret club almost. Like it's like your skull and crossbones kind of thing. Like you got to say the password to get past the door kind of idea. And so when I see people with tattoos on their arms or on their legs and they have like an X somewhere on their body, or maybe they're wearing a shirt with like some wacky font and there's an X on the front and they have that look, I often like almost want to ask them like, "Hey, are you straight edge?" And but I've grown out of it enough to know it's like just let them be. Like, there's no point in asking. Like, you know
Well,
what it's about.
especially in the hardcore scene, in the straight edge scene, and particularly in the 90s, like no one was doing the emo hair thing. No one was doing the paint. Like really, that's what we called goth. Like if you had the hair and the painted
Yeah,
fingernails and stuff, that was goth. And then eventually it became emo. Emo meant a totally different thing when I was a kid, but it became attached to like the screamo metal, My Chemical Romance, Under Oath, and all of that. But like when I thought about hardcore, it was guys in jeans and a t-shirt, you
yeah,
know. And so I was like jeans, shorts, and a t-shirt. And I was a nerd. Like I was in a band, but we were like all it was like two Chinese dudes that I grew up with that were like that had a 5.0 in the international baccalaureate program, right? And me like who want to draw comics and total dork and but I played music and I had that X. So yeah, we would get that. At least as a joke, people would
yeah.
be for it. Can you explain straight edge? Because I imagine that a large chunk of the audience has no idea what the hell we're talking about.
Yeah, so straight edge is just a lifestyle in which there is like an abstention from very specific things. So no, I guess like, and I kind of talk about this a little bit in the book, but there is, in my like opinion, a gray area of what these three staples are that make up straight edge, in that you ask a few different people and you're going to get a different answer, but the main two are like no tobacco usage, no smoking, um, anything of that, like weed, no drugs, and no alcohol. And the third thing is just basically any kind of vice. So like no vice to inhibit your ability to function or to dull your mind. And
Hmm.
so people use that as sort of a means to live their lives in a way that they see as um, something that's like able to keep them from having to cope in different ways with the world. They take on the pressure and the experience of everyday life just with their own ability and without having to like dull your mind to without having to um, rely on something else to get you to a normal state, essentially is what it boils down to.
Basically, don't go chasing dopamine from an easy fix to get
Yeah,
over the hard things that you're dealing with in your life. Like learn how to face it like raw and naked almost.
exactly.
Yeah, see, and that's where you're hinting at like how this developed and some of these thoughts in the book. And well, I shouldn't say hinting, but you're going even more deep into it and explaining the history of it. Um, and in that, I realized like, hey, like I never was like, hey, I'm straight edge. Or I was never, at the time I was Christian, and so a lot of those same things came from the Christian mindset, but it was always like rules that we were given. Whereas now I look back on it like, if you really read the Bible, it's not like you must do this. It's more like, hey, if you want things to go well, here's a suggestion of how you should go about it. That's probably wise. But at the time it was don't do, don't do, don't do. And yeah, I just growing up with that being everything that I consumed, I didn't realize until I read your book how much that has become a part of my life. Where, I mean, I didn't do any drugs, drinking, nothing like that until I was in my 30s. I think I was 32 or whatever when I ate a brownie with weed in it for the first time. I was like 30 maybe when I had my first drink. Um, and I've always had that like I always used to say I'm a staunch individualist. Like it's all about what I can accomplish with my own power, which was once I became, I moved away from Christianity. It's like, what else is there left? You're here in this reality, and you can't trust anyone but yourself.
Yeah.
And so, like, and that's where I was like, oh, I got all that from hardcore. I didn't know it. I mean, I know which life circumstances kind of taught me that too. I almost died from eating a peanut when I was 3, and I saw my dad freaking out because he couldn't save me. And at 3, I must have learned even dad can't is not a superhuman. You got to do all this stuff yourself. But then I grew up in the 90s where that was like such a big part of it too. So I think in that sense, like I really do resonate with the idea of shred, even though now like I use THC products and stuff, there still is this very core of myself that it's like it's me against the world.
Mhm.
And like I have to be competent because I can't trust anyone else to be. And it seems like that damage you're talking about in hardcore, there's a lot of people that experience a lot of shitty stuff that say, I have to be self-sufficient.
Yeah. And I think that's what it's that feeling is what binds them all and like really connects a lot of people. Like thank God there are like actually some like really normal people sometimes. But like, most of the time there aren't many normies that you find in that scene. Like I can
Yeah.
think of people that I've just met over the years where I'm like, man, like you've been through the ringer. It makes
Yeah.
sense why you're here.
Yeah. Same with punk too. You kind of get those punk anarchist kids that they'll have like these houses where they all kind of flop in and they live
Yeah.
that life, but then the support they give each other is so important because they're all coming out of broken homes and stuff. It's the first time they find family, is the sense I get. I've also known a lot of people that are more over in that scene, um, the anarchists and that kind of stuff, that I feel like have that same coming together for and finding like-minded family for the first time later in life.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar experience for sure. I think that that idea is what like that kernel started as with punk and then became even more foundational within hardcore in a
Hmm.
lot of ways. And so even things like down to um political affiliation. Like there are people who I know who are outward communists, and like they find their group of people and they do their work together. Um, and that's because of the hardcore scene. And like,
Mm.
I don't feel any one way about their political leanings, but I just think it's interesting that it seems like even within this small category of people, they're like the binding tie is like, oh, these people from the hardcore scene, they're like, nobody else is going to do it unless we do it. Mindset is how they're able to like accomplish the things that they want to accomplish.
Yeah. And so now we'll try and wrap back around to comics, but I think a lot of comic artists work with that same, we are the like I can do it myself art form in a sense. So when you were going back to comics, you said you walked into that store and started seeing stuff. What was some of the stuff that was catching your eye and bringing you back into the comics scene?
It's a lot different than what I read today, that's for sure. It was more of the like big two kind of things. So I was
Okay.
like right around the time that they did it was I think either yeah, it had to have been a little bit before New 52, if I believe
Okay.
my timeline is correct. And but I was reading like the Jason Aaron Thor, God Butcher, God Bomb kind of arc. Superior Spider-Man was one that I was like blown away by
Who
with all
was
the
on that
different
book at the time? Do you remember?
it's Dan Slott and like a whole slew of artists. So there's like uh
Uh, was that when
Christos
he was doing like
Gage.
one a week and they were coming out like one a week and he had rotating artists to handle the load?
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of books. I remember like at the time, maybe it was a monthly. I can't remember, but I know that there was like there was like Ryan Stegman at one point. There was Christos Gage. There was Giuseppe Cumincoli. There was Humberto Ramos.
Yeah.
Did some stuff in there too. And then those kinds of books, like I got a little bit bored of pretty quickly. Not to say that those are boring books, like they're not at all. Um, and like Batman, the Greg Capullo, Scott Snyder
Mm,
Batman was like so cool to get back into the that kind of storytelling with. But the more time went by, I just found that the superhero stuff was not something that I was interested in. And there was like a level of like realism to the art that when I see that stuff, that's like how my dad draws. And for
mm,
me, it's less of like I don't like how my dad draws. Like I love how my dad draws. He's an exceptional artist. But I can't draw like that. And I just can't, I don't connect with it in the same way. And I think I saw, uh, yeah, it had to have been Black Science
mm,
with Remender and Matteo Scalera.
mm-hmm.
And it just was like, whoa. And what it was cool even after the fact is when I bought the book, one of my friends who worked at the store, he mentioned, "Oh yeah, like this dude's from punk rock. Like Rick Remender is like a hardcore guy."
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
yeah, and like so it just made it that much cooler to me. And so it made me refocus on, well, what are these like independent books? Like what's that about? And it like I just went nuts and it opened up a whole new world to me where like now my interests are a little bit more in line with like and I think you can kind of tell this from my work, but like Mignola, Andrew McLean, Darwin, Allred, the sort of more ink slinger, brush style um, people who uh, they don't tell necessarily, like they do have moments where they tell like this sort of generic big two stories, but they're mostly focused on um, what interests them and
Yeah.
what they're passionate about. And I think that comes through a lot of the time in their work. And that inspired me to be like, well, kind of like what you're saying, like, well, shoot, I can draw. I have a degree in screenwriting, so why not actually use it on something that I can be proud of and is something that I think is beneficial to like the comics community as a whole.
The screenwriter thing makes a lot of sense because um the art's great, and but one of the things that stood out to me was the way that you structured the story, because like I said, I was a little bit skeptical at first, and then you made it clear why you were doing that as you went on, and totally won me over. And I was like, oh yeah, you couldn't do this any other way. And I actually thought that the structure of how you did it was very sophisticated, and was like, this is this guy's first book, like he picks up quick. So that makes sense that you have some kind of actual technical training in how to structure and form a project. Because this is, I mean, you're looking at a, you would probably know better than me. How many pages is this? You don't
I
have
think
page
it's
numbers.
just over 100 and it's like 108 maybe.
Yeah, like 100 some odd page graphic novel, and this is your first major project. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean it's my first like complete thing. I anything else, so I kickstarted the first issue in 2019 and it was like it was a good learning experience because what had happened was I was just like I got to do this, like I was saying, like I just got to do it, like I got to make a comic instead of just talking about how cool comics are. Like I have this skill set and I made, I think it's like it's essentially part one in the book. So something like 12 pages. And I was shocked to find that people were interested enough in what I was doing. So I was able to get it kickstarted fully. And then, the pandemic happened. We moved to Columbus, Ohio. And while I was there, it had to get put on the back burner for a while. And I started watching like kayfabe and then you guys, and I was like, man, like I just got to get this thing done. Like I've been sitting on it for 3 years now, and I don't want to. I just didn't want to do like the uh do another issue, do another issue, do another issue kind of thing. Because to me, from like a customer perspective, if I'm walking up to somebody's table at like a convention and they're trying to tell me, "Oh yeah, buy this first issue," to me, unless I know they're a publisher or they're like an established entity, I kind of am like a little bit. I almost like tune out because it's like you want me to pay $12 for this 12-page book? No way.
A
And
page, a dollar a page, yeah.
yeah, and like cool, it was printed on a like risograph printer. That doesn't make me want to buy it more, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's cool to
You're
look
being
at.
discriminating, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And like I think like what those people do is awesome. It's not something I can do. But like as it from a customer standpoint, I want to have something that's like done. I can read it and I can have the whole story, kind of like that like binge
Yeah.
mindset almost from like TV. And so I just like went to town and I at the same time went to the Billy Ireland downtown in Columbus, and
Mm,
it like blew my mind, and that like lit a fire under me. I was like,
I
you could see
bet.
Frank Miller pages, and at the time, this was really cool. They had a pogo exhibit of all of Walt Kelly's, a bunch of stuff like original art, um, random like ads that he had illustrated and stuff like that. It was one of the coolest experiences, and like that's my favorite museum in the world, and it's not that
Yeah.
big or anything, but man, that place is awesome. And after that, I was just like, let's get this done. And I wanted to just try and make something that would kind of like what we've been talking about, give those people who have read the book something more, and then also try to get more people into this scene to make it grow in that more positive way.
Well, I think something that you did that's really really smart in the book, and this was one of the things I love so much about the hip hop family tree stuff as well, is first off, when you're talking about bands, I have like a guide to go back and be like, oh, I've heard of Bad Brains so much. I had no idea they were important to hardcore. I should go listen to them. And I'm like, oh, wow, like I had no idea. And then you have a nice list of like, check all this out. You may not like 10 of them, but the 11th one you'll like. And I think that was really important to create the bridge for the audience. Are you finding that the people that are coming to the book are coming to it from both sides, or is it more comic people coming, learning about hardcore, or hardcore people coming and buying their first comic?
It's a little bit of both, I think. I've noticed that, which is surprising to me. So like I have it at the local shop that I go to. Um, and he was able to sell out of all the issues that I gave him or the copies that I gave him. And um, he was telling me about these people who would come in, and it's mostly hardcore kids, like hardcore kids, because there's that crossover of like hardcore kids interested in collecting records and merch and all that kind of stuff that then get interested in uh, collecting comics.
Hmm.
And he'll see somebody come in with a T-shirt on that looks like a hardcore shirt, and he'll say, "Hey, you look like you're into hardcore music," and he'll make the sale that way.
That's
But
smart.
when, yeah, and what's interesting is at Free Comic Book Day, I was there this year at the store, and I sold some copies myself, and it was mostly people who were interested in like
Okay.
music in general, not people who even were aware of hardcore. Or maybe it was like one guy came up and he was like kind of like me, like a lapsed hardcore guy who grew up in the scene and uh hadn't spent some time, but his like wife was there and tell him like, hey, like check this out, like it's like what you grew up listening to, and like that opened his eyes to it. So it's those kinds of experiences. It's a little bit of both, which is cool because it means that people from all over, like there isn't necessarily like one type of person who would read the book. It means like a
Yeah.
lot of different people would read it, and that makes me hopeful that there's almost like a not like a never ending audience for it, but I think
Hmm.
it's sort of evergreen in that way where uh you can have somebody pick it up at any point in time. And sure, there might not be bands after or records in the back of that list that you mentioned um past like I guess like 2023 or 2024, but also like there's you give them enough, they're going to find that stuff, so they'll get there
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah, you have a span of like from what mid to late 70s up to the early 2020s. You've got a pretty good span of music, and you start plugging that into YouTube, the algorithm will take care of the rest.
Yeah, exactly. There's much better and smarter technology than my abilities can lend to people.
Which is maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing.
Yeah, who knows?
We'll find out. But yeah, it does, like projects like this seem really smart to me. There was another one, like an anthology I got recently called Cicadas, that was by Riley, I think was the guy's name, from the band Power Trip. He died and they
Yeah,
released it
yeah,
afterwards. But the plan for that was to sell it at the merch tables. And I thought, oh, that's like so smart, is like you're to find these other venues outside of the comic shop, because if we just keep putting stuff in comic shop and bookstores, we're not going to grow the
yeah,
audience for the medium. And I think things like your book, you start looking for those other, like you could sell it at the local record store. It doesn't have
right.
to be at the comic shop. You could sell it at the merch table at a local shows, or a buddy has a band and it. Um, I think it's a really good, smart kind of yeah, a crossover point between two very rabid fan bases.
Yeah. And it's cool that you got that Power Trip book from
Mhm.
or the book from Riley, because there's that he's like a guy that I think um maybe not in like an obvious way, but was on my mind when I was working on stuff, because like he passed during me like creating the book, and I knew he had a connection to comics, and it was just like, man, like it'd be like, look at this guy who could have had like a cool in with comics. Like, what's cooler than Power Trip? And
Yeah.
like, imagine him doing a book with like Daniel Warren Johnson, and I knew that they were friends.
Oh man, that
And
would be good.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. And like Daniel's done a bunch of drawings of Riley and Power Trip over the years, and um, I just would be so cool. So I was like, man, like there's more people out there than I think a lot of people in the comics world realize, and a lot of people in the music world realize. So like, let's bring them together. You know, like let's make sure that there's a way that those two cultures can grow a lot better.
And it's funny because when you're dealing with artists like in the comics community, I mean, I feel like there's so many people that put their playlists in the back of their books, and so many people like myself and Sean who are also like play music. We're in bands, still play music. Um, and yeah, we don't like even I don't know. I mean, we've been doing this channel for 3 years now, something like that, and this is probably the first time we've ever really extensively talked to anyone about music. It's just kind of like it comes up and we'll use it as an analogy or something. Um, and it's wild because why aren't the artists talking about the music that they listen to or the music they play and how that influences them? And I don't know. I just don't see that. So I think you're right that there's a real untapped vein in the comics community of that we can use to reach out our love for music. Like there's a whole other community of people that love something really passionately that we share a connection with.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I guess that's kind of a good place to end it and say like Hunter's one of the people doing the good work. He's creating the gap for, and there's I don't want to like kick off a whole new genre of books, but you've got hip hop family tree, you've got a history of hardcore. There's a lot of projects like that could exist. And I think more projects like this that address those relationships between the thing. I mean, you look at Love and Rockets. That's part of the success of that is it was tied to a music scene. It spoke to people outside of the comics industry and brought new people in. And I really think you're doing that. And when you sent this over, you had no idea that I loved heavy music. And so I was really, really, really appreciate that you would send over something you put so much time on. You just give it over gratis. And I enjoyed it so thoroughly. I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us. Everyone, please go out and support Hunter. If you like music at all, you'll enjoy this book. If you've never listened to heavy music, you definitely need to go read it and give it a look and do some learning. And if you're into heavy music, then you'll enjoy it even more. But thank you so much, Hunter, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the nice words you said about my book. I feel like I'm just like blown away, man. Like I know I said it at the top, but I'm really like thankful and grateful that you're even having me on the channel and like reviewing my book. It's just nuts. It's so cool. So I appreciate it.
It's just like I said, it's just people who enjoy making comics. Speaking of that, are there what's next? Are you working on any more comics?
The thing that I'm working on next, so I have two things. The one is being colored by someone. We're not sure what we're gonna do with it. It's me working with another writer um, on art. And then the thing that I'm working on in my free time uh, is a book about, I don't know how much I want to give away, but I'll just say it's about not like autobio, but about an experience I've had with owning a dog. And it's like we just put our dog down, and it's sort of
Oh,
about the
yeah.
experience of having a dog like the one that we had and like what happens around you.
Okay.
So I don't know if like I'm gonna really try and finish it. I don't know if I actually will, but that's my focus right now. I've been writing it and getting ready to do some drawing on it.
So nothing like on the horizon that people should be looking at. They should just be going and getting the history of hardcore for now and following you so they can see where you go from here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, please, everyone, go check it out. It's a great book. Hunter's a great artist and a great writer, and your support will be, beneficial to him and then beneficial to us as a scene. So, thank you all. Thanks for joining it, and I'll see you all later. The Exile by Eric Creek is a gorgeously illustrated Viking saga of revenge. Eric Creek calls it his Viking Western. It's about a guy who's been away on the warpath and is returning home to some family troubles that have to be resolved. And this is told in just this amazing, like, kind of three-color art style that looks like old woodblock cuts or something. It's absolutely gorgeous book that you've got to pick up.